Hello there, this is Chris. My name is CE.Simgof in GSPro Design World. Back here with another video. It's been a while. I'm going to try and do some more though. I'm not entirely sure how this one's going to go, but I want to try and keep it semi-short and talk a little bit about sat shading and how it plays with vertex colors in Blender and how I use it and some of the pitfalls and corrections and tricks. I'll try not to make it too long. I will say it's not going to get into color theory, matching, artistry, things like that. Those things are certainly able to be learned, and there are some tricks and things there as well. It's also something you just pick up with repetition and experimentation, and there's not a question I get more often than how did you match that? How did you get that look, that color? And part of it's just a natural eye, and part of it's just you know, I've had art classes and just a lot of repetition, and it comes more naturally to some people, I suppose. But let's look at just the technical aspect of some material setup with satellites. Not a lot of people are doing sat shading. A lot of people are asking me about it. And there's some videos, but this one will give you some tricks. Anyway, enough talking. Here's my Unity project. I'm currently, when this video is recording, starting a rebuild of the Fold, which was my first course a couple of years ago. I'm trying some new tricks with it. I think it holds up, but I'm trying some new stuff, and it's a good opportunity to look at sat shading. Partly because my sat is mostly done, even though there are a few changes, and so not as much work to show you. So what you're seeing here is in Unity I have a few holes that I'm working on that I've tested that are done. Actually, let's start with a hole that's done. I'm gonna go over here to this par 3 and look at it. So this one, I've done the sat work on it already. It looks like I've got a little tweaking to do on color matching here. That's a good opportunity to show you. But this is using both satellite and a lot of vertex painting to pull this off, these looks. You'll see, because this is kind of a test file, that I haven't used set mesh. That's probably a different video to talk about that workflow. But you don't see everything over on this right hand panel when you click on a material. They don't all have everything that you need for gameplay, or I guess not gameplay, but setup. So for instance, you have no show vertex color. Well, that's pretty easy. You can do show vertex color here, and then you've got that component. Now I've done some painting in Blender. I've done this in Blender. You could do it in Unity as well. And the theory behind this is the red and the blue, to an extent, are using the satellite shading as a base. So if you were to look in the material, let's turn off this, and if you were to look at the fairway material, you'll see I have my sat shader, the Fold Sat Overlay JPEG, in my satellite. I have my terrain size, which for this course is pretty small. This is my inner terrain size, 1400. And then if you go down here, you've got red, use satellite base, green, not using satellite base, and then blue is, right? So let's look at this again and talk about why we're doing it that way. So our red and our green is using the satellite overhead images as its base. That means that from above and from far away, that is mostly what you're going to see because of the way I have it set up. So again, if I hide it, you can see, you know, the variation and stuff from the satellite. But as you get closer, inside a detail distance, what you're really seeing is the detail texture. And these are not final at this point. This is a little washed out in my opinion. But if you go down and look at, this is the red area, right? So you've got detail opacity, 0.3, and then fall off and all that stuff. If I were to crank this up to 1, the satellite will disappear. You'll see only detail. You can see that that tile's pretty bad as well, right? And that's why we use a base. Whether you're using a satellite for base or something else for a base, that's going to break up that tiling. So if I go back down to my 0.32 or wherever I was at, that's partly why it's a little faded, like it doesn't look crisp here, because I've got the opacity down a lot. The other thing you can change is the detail distance, and then it starts to fade out after that far. So if I went back to 1 for this, and you can see at about 8 yards from the camera, the detail starts disappearing until slowly it becomes just satellite again, just the base. If I zoom out, you'll see it goes away completely, right? So that only appears as you get closer, and that's that detail distance. So if I'm out here and I change my detail distance to something like 100, you'll see it from far away from the camera, right? All right. That's the theory behind a base and a detail distance. Now there's so much more in here to this. If you were to look at my blue, I think you can see there's a little difference. See how it's kind of a little darker color? And if you go in here, you can see it's a little smoother, a little different. Again, this is not final, but my idea on that is I'm setting up kind of a patchy looking fairway. This is a public city course. It's not Augusta. It's going to have clover here and there. It's going to have, you know, a different kind of grass in patches here and there. So I want to kind of simulate that, and I will later be adding my own texture. Maybe I'll even use a clover or something so that this will match mostly in color, but I want it to look a little different. And I will probably use just the short detail distance. So from far away, you'll see the color difference, a little patchy, a little darker, and as you get closer, you might actually see that clover or that crabgrass or whatever I end up using. Nothing too extreme as that probably, but just something that's a little different. Give it a little unique flair. All right. Now you can use different than satellite for your base, and it will still look good. Most setups use that. Any non-sat shading setup for materials, that's how it's set up. And you end up with these base textures that cover and overlap what the detail texture is, and that breaks up some of that tiling that you see really bad if you have long detail distance. Now, one of the hazards, or I guess not a hazard, but one of the things that's just so difficult and so time consuming on sat shading is just, depending on your course overhead, the image that you get, there's going to be a lot of cloning, taking out things like trees. Maybe there's a golf cart on the course at the time. Most of it's going to be trees and shadows that you're trying to get rid of. So let's look at a place where this is mostly done, like I said, but I actually fudged it a little bit to show you some of the things that can happen. So let's look at the image we're using here. This is that green that we're currently pointing at. Now, can anyone guess why my bunkers look like this? Well, I'm not using sat shading on my bunker material at all, just vertex paint. So I want them to be cloned out. They don't even need to be there, but this, I just cloned around the edges so that the rough blends to it well, and it doesn't exist. I'm not using the bunkers as a sat shader. So how you set up sat shading, I have exported from Inkscape an 8K version of the splines. I'll change this opacity back to 100. So this is my splines from Inkscape, and I put it the same size. It should be the same size as your sat image because that's what you're drawing over the top to create these, but it's never going to match perfect, right? I mean, as good as you can draw your shapes, they're never going to be exactly perfect on your fairway lines and your rough lines and stuff. So you put that on top of, I have probably 60 layers in this Photoshop file. That's kind of crazy, but it's because a lot of these holes literally don't exist. I had to draw and paint the sat from other things. But here, this sat base, this is going to be more or less your default image. So if I take the splines down in opacity, you'll be able to see how they overlap. Now let's go down here. And you can see, if I go down here, can you see how it's not perfect? You can see, especially right where my cursor is right now, right here, there's a little bit of green that bumps out past where this line is. What I've done when I've pulled these in is I selected things. For instance, I had selected all of the green shapes. I selected by color, and I saved them as a selection. So I can load that selection at any time. I'm going to load my greens, and that will show not just that green, but all greens on the course will be circled at once. They're all active selections now. If I get rid of this, now I don't need that. You can really see how, in this case, the green on the satellite goes outside of the spot where I splined it, because this selection line is where my spline is. So if I were to go in and then apply these textures in Unity, you should sort of be able to see that mess up. So I'm going to go in here. First I'm going to find my folder and I'm going to go my green. I'm dragging these on. I'm not using set mesh. I'm just dragging them on. So there's green, fairway, and then we're going to go with the blend green, which is this blend shape, right? Now because I've done no vertex painting, you can see that my blend does not match, and we can figure that out too. But what I want to focus on here is, do you see this little halo of lighter color right here? So that right there is my, where in the satellite image my green comes outside of the shape. This is not too extreme, not a huge deal, but it is a little, I don't know, sloppy, unprofessional, not perfect. So that's not going to fly in my book. You know, you want imperfections, but you want your shapes defined. If, for instance, the fairway bled hard into the rough somewhere, or even a tiny bit, it's going to give you a much lighter color, and especially your 3D grass, if you have that set up to use sat shading, then that as well is going to be much lighter, and it's going to look awfully strange. So there's two ways to fix this. One, of course, is to go into Photoshop, and what we want to do is we want to make sure that this is gone. So instead of loading the green, I'm actually going to be working on the fairway. I want to get rid of it. So I'm going to go select, I'm going to load my fairway, and I'm on my sat base, which is the layer where my main holes are. This is an existing hole. I'm going to take my stamp tool, and I'm going to just clone in. So I'm going to select over here and then move in a little bit, and I'm going to paint fairway over the top of that area. All right. Now I'm going to deselect. You've got a harder edge there. I'm going to save this over the top of the overlay. That's what I'm using in my sat materials. And replace that. Now once that's saved, it's going to automatically update when I go back to Unity. And most of that halo is going to disappear. Now you can see there's still a tiny bit there, right? That's because it's almost impossible to get it perfect. You can see a little bit of it back here and just a hair of overlap there, right? Why is it impossible to get it perfect? Well, because if you think about where these shapes are, there is a hard edge in Unity where that material is, right? It transitions right away. But if you were to zoom way in, you're dealing with an image that's covering an entire course. Each one of these pixels spans like maybe a whole foot and a half. I'm not sure. It's impossible to get it perfectly clean because just the large area that your satellite is covering from a material and texture standpoint. So you can get really close, but not perfect because there's usually going to be bleed. So if I were to completely, the only way to completely satellite eliminate that edge would be to paint more fairway over the top of the green. And then you're going to end up with a dark spot on your green, which the material is reading as the fairway texture from the satellite. So here's what we're doing. If we go into Blender and we look at this shape, you'll see on this hole that I have, if I go up here to show attributes, I have no vertex painting. I haven't done anything on this hole. That is different than if you were to look at all these other holes that I've already worked on. Now, if we go to this part 3, you'll see that here's our workflow. You see green all the way around. You see green all the way around here. I use, and this is just my preference, so I can keep it straight, I use green as my no satellite blend material. I use it on borders of things. So if I were to go to, when I go to this new hole we're working on here, I'm going to go to vertex mode, edit vertex mode, select the entire loop of the outside here, and I'm going to paint that. Let's see, I've got it at 1 strength. Yep. Paint all that green, okay? I'm also going to go and I'm going to paint the entire ring of the fairway around the green, the entire ring of the fairway around the outer perimeter of the entire thing that touches the rough. And then just because it just kind of makes sense, I'm going to shift, hold down, and select vertexes kind of in any small area like that, or anywhere that I think I want to have this no sat area, okay? I also think of it in my head, I justify it as your cleanup cut, like as a lawnmower. So you'll frequently see around the edges of striped fairways, they do a perimeter cut, and that's their cleanup cut, right? So if I do all of those as green as well, now I need to export these shapes and pull them into Unity. So I'm going to pause and export those in, and we'll take a look at what it shows now. All right, let's jump back in. It should auto-update those shapes. And you can see it changed significantly, right? You now have what looks like a cleanup cut around the green. You've got this dark shape around the fairway. And now where we had that satellite halo area, that gets covered up now by this stripe of no satellite material. So you look in here again, we did this before, the green does not use satellite. It uses a different base, right? Now, matching that to the rest of the course is the trickiest thing. If you were to look at one of these holes that's got it done already, you can see that I'm not super excited and happy with that color. I'm trying to get it to match the darkest portion of the mauve stripe, because that's what it is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the cleanup mauve stripe, right? And I find to match the darker stripe better than matching the lighter stripe. Otherwise, it's too stark a difference with the rough. So as far as adjusting materials, this is where that artistic part comes in. But you go into these detail areas, and specifically you got 3 options. You can change the overall color, which is up here in this small area. You can change the base color, or you can change the detail color. Now remember, if you change the detail color, it's only going to change that color in the space that your detail distance is. In this case, the green detail distance is only 12 yards. So if we change the color there, it's going to still look like that brown out here. So I would suggest doing either a base change or a overall change, which would be here. Now you can see you can just slide amount and it's going to darken or lighten it. But in this case, even to me, it looks a little too yellow. So the tweaks here doesn't take much to make a change. So you can see if you go towards I'm sliding this towards green, and that's going to take out some of that yellow, and then it's going to match better that way. That's already pretty good, right? If we go over here and look at another one, from hole to hole, it's going to be different. It might look a little different than you expect it to look. For instance, on this hole, it looks quite dark, and that's just because there's a little bit of difference in the lightness of the satellite itself around here. So if you were to go into the Photoshop file, the texture that it's next to, so we have a dark here, this fairway that it's abutting, that it's sharing space with, is a lighter fairway color than if you go over here. You can see this is a much kind of darker look. So that can be tricky. You can try and play with your satellite hole by hole to make sure things are pretty consistent. Most satellites will be pretty consistent. The difference here is that this is a real hole. This is an actual satellite. And this over here is not real. This I completely painted on my own because this is a fake hole. So I just didn't get the color quite right. So again, this is color theory. This is stuff that it's just going to take a lot of playing. You could make a duplicate. you could have more than one version of each material. So I could make a duplicate of my fairway. And so for fairways that had a little lighter in the satellite area, you could have just a little bit lighter material set up to try and match the rest of the course, right? Now, what you need to see here is there's a little bit off here because I changed this. Remember, I changed this from a sort of brown to a little bit more of a green to match better. If you look really carefully, it's going to be hard to see. This is my blend shape. Can you see how it doesn't quite blend? This vertex color, this part of the blend is a little browner, and this one's a little greener because this was set up to match with the other. Now, I'm not using the set mesh, I'm not using the update blends because I have some other shenanigans going on in different areas that won't update anyway. So when I make material changes, and I try not to do it often because this is what it takes, I'll go into the thing I just changed, my fairway. And if you remember, I was changing the green color, so I'm going to go fold fairway green. Then I'm going to go find the blend, right? Now, if you can either do show vertex, or you can go in here and look and see what my color is. Now, this is a 3-color blend. So my green side color, if you look at it here, is red. So it goes red, blue, black, right? So back in here, I want my black, which is the outside that touches that, to be the same as my green. So then you copy across, and you can see that that greened up. Now you have a perfect match there, and that material blends. Unfortunately, that's kind of the process anytime you change a vertex color. So right now, this is a little bit unrealistic just because of how dark that fairway edge is here. And I'll have to play with that, decide if I'm going to do it based on color, or decide if I'm going to go in and, for instance, change how dark the satellite is up against that for material color, right? All right. So here's another satellite trick that I like to use. If you go look at a different part of this hole, you have this bunker, and there's this area right here. You can see that's looking a little different. It's not regular rough. I decided I just wanted to make that kind of natural prairie grass long rough, but on the real course, and this is a real hole, it's not. So what I do is I will load, again, my selection I've already created of deep rough. And so you can see this is all deep rough. Now this is also part of the deep rough, right? So it's close already. It looks different, but it doesn't look quite like this other prairie grass in these areas in here. The very easy way to do this is you find an area on your course that you want it to look like. You find a stamp tool. You sample that area. You come over here and you just clone in that kind of deep rough, right? Now you can see that I've got some other stuff going on here that I kind of forgot about. I've got a deep rough overlay that I'm using just to kind of even out the color. I'm going to erase that. But anyway, the idea is you can go out and find areas of rough that look like what you want it to be in different parts of your surrounding area. And you're not limited to your golf course. You don't only have to use texture and image from your SAT overlay, from your one generated by the LiDAR process SAT overlay. Go out to Google Maps, and so they've updated the satellites since I made this course the first time, but this is that hole. You can see over here there's no golf holes. That's what I created. But go out to Google Maps and go, man, I need some deep rough. I need some prairie area. I'm just going to find a different part of the world, do a screen capture of the Google satellite anywhere, pull that into Photoshop either as a layer or in a different file, and clone from that and use it. And you're not limited to just doing that for something like deep rough. If you don't like the fairway texture in a certain spot or can't get a good spot of deep rough, find a different golf course that looks similar or looks like something that you might want to use. Now, this is our country club. I'm not going to use that for a city course, but you're not limited to it. Let's go up to, maybe there's a better view on our other city course, Northern Hills. So here, this is almost a better satellite. There's a little less trees in the way in some areas like that. clone out some fairway from there. Clone out some, if you find a nice big mode area of something, just do a screen capture of that and use it on your course, okay? See, like right here, this is the driving range for this course. But what the driving range really is, it's just mode regular rough, right? So find somewhere like that, anywhere in the world. It doesn't even have to be a golf course. Find a big field or something that looks like rough or whatever you need to clone in places on your golf course and screen capture that area and bring it into your golf course file in Photoshop. I actually have this reference folder set up for the fold, and you'll be able to see if I don't even know where they're going to pop up here, but if I come out, please look. If I pull up my rough reference, there, I've got this giant shape that I just made just by taking different areas of Google Earth, different parts of this course, and cloning it all together so that if I need a giant area rough cloned out, I can borrow from this image, this layer right here that I've already created to clone out giant areas or even add new holes. The same thing with the fairway. I have created a fairway over here. It's just a giant block of space here that I can just clone out or pull a whole new shape from and just punch out a new fairway if I want to add a hole. And that's not the end of it for me. I'll go in and I'll use different brushes and burns and desaturations and paint over to give it just some variation that you'd see in a regular fairway. You know, you can kind of see on this is a fake fairway, but you can see I've gone in here and I've painted in some browner areas and things like that just to give it some variety. But that's a really, really good trick. I also like to, when I have rough around a hole, this is a fake hole, this is a big hill. So think about where the sprinklers would be. They're gonna water the fairway, but they're not gonna water down the hill and other areas of rough. So rough that's right around your fairway is gonna be darker green than the rough that's away from your fairway a ways or down a hill or something like that. So that's just other touches you can add to stuff to kind of make it look that way. All right, let's jump back to Unity one more time. All right, we're gonna check a hole that I've kind of finished already, and I'm gonna show you how I go about using blends. I guess here's a good way to show from an overhead kind of that sprinkler thing I was talking about. I intentionally darkened the rough around this area and this area of huge regular mode rough, but of course there's not gonna be sprinklers over there, so I've got it drier, and there's also trees gonna be there. So anyway, let's look at a transition area. You've got your regular blend shape that we're using between fairway and rough, but when you come down here where the long grass is, you could do that, and yeah, it will look pretty natural because they're generally going to mow around deep rough areas too, but I kind of prefer a softer transition. I'm going to turn off the 3D grass here so you can kind of see what I mean. Turn off my grass renders. So the transition I'm using on these textures is very soft, and this is part of the reason why I don't use set mesh, because I get rid of blends on a lot of these areas. When I'm in, let's find that spot. When I am in Blender, before I start a lot of this stuff, I will join a lot of blend shapes, and I will get rid of them. So down here you can see I splined it so it wouldn't create a blend shape. But again, I've used green vertex paint. This is the deep rough shape. If I were to orient this a little better so you can see where we are. This is that green deep rough. This is the regular rough, and here's your fairway. So again, I've made sure that my standard rough is red along this entire loop that touches the deep rough. Then I've painted the entire loop of the deep rough that touches the rough green, because that's kind of in my brain, that's the color I use as my blend color. And then inside of Unity, I've used that channel editor to match my regular rough red color and copied it over to my deep rough green color. So now that blends without a blend shape, really slow, really smooth. If you want it to be sharper, you still can get that just by going in on the right panel here to the blend strengths. So right now, red is my regular color. I've got it all the way up at 10. If I were to change green, if I were to bring that up, you're going to see how sharp that becomes. The reason why it's not a sharp line is because if you were to look at the blender version of this, these are triangles, so it's reaching up to there and there, so you're not going to get a clean loop like you would on a blend shape. But that's okay, that's not what I'm going for, right? If I were to turn the green way down, you'll see the red come all the way out, and we're going to have to get rid of that if we don't want it there. But that's, if you turn off green, basically, you're going to uncover the other colors. So the trick is to use just enough green so that you get a full green blend matching right at the edge, and then have it fade away slowly so you don't see that weird kind of showing the geometry, showing those triangles as you get in there. When you set up your 3D grass, you're also going to want to try and match that to that, unless you want it to look more mode, right? So if we turn that back on, our grass, and yes, the deep rough will eventually be getting a full planting of GSPro grass and stuff like that. So then if you have other shapes that it's going to touch, you'll need to blend to that too. So here's a deep rough shape. It's blending to my what will become woodland or forest, so that's going to be more of just a dirt and sticks and stuff like that. In fact, I have one of those shapes back on that other hole. Let's go over here. It's always hard to navigate and figure out where to go. No, I want a small shape. There. So if you go in here, you can see that I've got rough to deep rough and deep rough to my woods. So again, turn these off, and you can see the transition from regular rough to what will be deep long grass not mowed to my forest floor. So that's how I manage the blending without using the auto update blend, and that's why, because I find it is easier to match. And there's the same kind of setup between, on my satellite, between my my deep rough shapes and my, there's the same setup on my satellite between my deep rough shapes and my forest floor. So my forest floor is actually not using satellite at all. It's not using any satellite base. It's just a material, just a regular non-sat material. So you can see if I were to turn down splines, I've tried to paint my rough, clone my rough right up to the edge of that, and then of course I'm using that blend color as a no sat color to transition from one to the other, because my rough is using sat. So the reason you use these colors as perimeters, again with no sat material, is to sort of mask where there's not perfect sat shading alignment, which is, it's impossible to get perfect, so that's kind of a necessity. You can just use the automatic blend shapes. Let's go back on the fairway. You can try to use that. It's going to be almost impossible though. It's just not enough space to perfectly clone. You'd have to be so perfect on your material setup. That's why that cleanup cut perimeter is pretty important. All right, so that got long again, of course. I know I didn't go through actually how you set up the materials. I know they're already set up in what I'm showing you, but it's pretty easy to do. Maybe I can run a separate video on that, but this gives you the theory, and again, it's all just going to be experimentation. So there you go. Have fun trying sat shading. I really recommend you do it. I really think it adds a lot, unless you just don't have a good satellite image to work from. I think that, as you can see, I just think that satellite adds just a ton to the realism. I do think it can be overdone. That's why I use opacity and why I use detail. And if you looked, I do a lot of Photoshop tricks as well. It's going to keep going here. If you look at my Photoshop, it is nothing as stark as what I came from, what I started with for a satellite base. So I have different things on here, like I have a brushed adjustments layer. That's just an overlaid color that's going to add some stuff to things. I use hue and saturation layers. If I turn those on, you can see that I usually use those to adjust the coloring of my entire sat. And those were actually turned off when I was doing this, so if I turn those on, I think you'll see an even better look. I didn't even realize those were off. I have color adjustments, which you can see in some areas, like, let's look up here. This fairway looks really beat up right here, right? So I went over, and in some areas that look like that, I dulled it. I painted some color over it. I tried to make it look a little less vivid or sharp, because that's when things start looking really kind of unnatural in Unity. Again, it's your eye. I have a deep rough overlay. You can see I kind of painted a color over my deep rough because, again, I want to mute it a little bit. I don't want it to be so kind of bam. And this right here where my cursor is, that's the wood, so that's why it doesn't have that overlay. So if I turn on all those things, I'm going to pause now. I'm going to update my satellite one more time and show you inside of Unity what it looks like when I have all those adjustments turned on now. So it's a small change. It has updated. You can see things are a little bit less bright green, a little more muted. And you can do that kind of changes, of course, with your PPV. Can change some of that on the fly and stuff. It's better to try and get things dialed in as much as you can just with that sat shading. So here, this is another complete hole. This one's done. And you can see this area right here where we had that really kind of bad fairway. Let's turn that off. Man, I just keep making these videos longer. But I want to show you why I do some of these things. Let's turn off some of these things that mute stuff. I'm going to turn off my rough color. I'm going to turn off my adjustments. So that's going to take away where I tried to cover up that bad fairway. So this is just working with saturation and levels and stuff like that. So we can leave those. But if I were to save this now and show you what it looks like without, if you only took your satellite and you cloned out the things you didn't like, and you made no color adjustments, you did no painting, that's all fine. But let's look at just the small difference it can make. So we're going to go in here and let it update. So again, some of this is going to be preference. Maybe some of you like this look, but you can see how much more kind of deep and how much more contrast there is now in my deep rough, which, okay, I'll admit I kind of dig the way it looks, but it looks, I don't know, to me this looks unrealistic. It looks like the actual satellite, which sounds stupid to say that doesn't look realistic. But I think that when you have too much satellite happening, it's not necessarily a good thing. Again, in the fairway, it's, you've got a very distinct beat up fairway now, right? So does it look realistic? I don't know. I guess that's up to you. In my opinion, I think muting what the material underneath is and then planting very well on top of that is going to give you a better look or a more convincing game look. This is maybe uncanny valley. Is that the best way to describe it? I would say that's how I would put it. It's uncanny valley. It looks realistic, but sort of wrong because your brain knows that you're playing a game. But it's not one or the other. You can, play with how much overlay you use. I'll pause again and turn that back on. And there it is with those layers turned back on in Photoshop. So, you can adjust the opacity of those layers. You can take them down. Now you know why it takes me so long to design a course, because I think about all these things and I tweak them constantly, trying to find the perfect balance where my eye says, hey, that looks awesome, and it doesn't look like an uncanny valley. It looks like a game, but like a realistic game, not like someone took a Google satellite and asked you to hit golf balls on it, because that's not the goal. We can do better than that, people. We can do better. So there you go. That's the overall theory of how you set up sat shading. Well, how you make sat shading look good. We'll try to maybe get to one more video where we look at the start from scratch, how it's set up. Thanks for watching. CE.Simgof out.